the lecture. We are honored tonight to have Professor Richard Hovannisian give us a lecture on the subject mainly of In Search of Armenian Cilicia, but he's also going to talk a little bit about his other trips in Western Armenia. I don't know what to say about Professor Hovannisian. His biography is a few pages, the brief one, and his publications are numerous. His books and edited books and written books are numerous, so everybody already knows him. People like him should be national treasures, essentially. And we need more of that caliber of people. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Hovannisian.
Thank you very much. Do you have the maps ready to show?
Yes. Maps.
10 days ago, I returned from a third journey to our historic lands, and Dr. Hovannisian has kindly made a map to show where those journeys have taken me in the last few years. The first time I've spoken about this, and I've now spoken several times about my journeys, and I was at first very reluctant because it was very personal. But as time went on, I found that sharing was useful. But the point I made, if you could go on to the next one, please. Next one. No, back, please. Here, let me just tell you, and then I'll go back. The first trip that I took with Bartiter, we started in Armenia, went along the Black Sea to Trebizond, which is in green, on the Black Sea. And then we went on through Gümüşhane to Bayburt and Erzurum. And from Erzurum to Erzincan, and from Erzincan down to Kemach, where many thousands of Armenian women and children were slaughtered in the Kemach Gorge in 1915, and left a very deep impression on us as we saw that gorge. And then down to Arabkir and beautiful Agan, with its Ag, you know, in Armenian means a source of water, and there are many, many streams that come from Agan, and a place of Armenian intellectual life. And from there to my parents' birthplace in Kharpert, to my mother's village of Keserig, which is famous for its cabbage, its lahana. And everyone would say in the old days, which is still there and a part of now the provincial capital known as Elazığ. Kharpert is now the fortress up above, and Elazığ is what we used to call Mezre. And my father's village, Bazmashen, which is only rubble and nothing there. And from Kharpert on to Mush and to Van, Bitlis and to Van, at a time when they were reconstructing the church. The Turkish government had spent a lot of money to reconstruct the church at Van on Ahtamar Surkhaç. And as we know, since that time, it has been opened as a museum. There was a great controversy whether or not they could put the cross on top of the church, and at first they said, no, we won't put the cross on. But then after the Armenian clergy was invited to do a badarak in Ahtamar, they still didn't have the cross up, but it was a very major event they used for PR. But thereafter, in the middle of the night, they erected the cross, and the cross is now on the church of Surkhaç in Ahtamar. That was the first trip, and it was probably the last time that I saw Hrant Dink on flying back to Constantinople just before he was assassinated, and his fear at that time about what was going to happen, and he kept on saying, I don't mind being a martyr myself, but do I have a right to jeopardize the lives of my children? Because they were also receiving death threats at the time, and very shortly thereafter he was gone. If we can go now to the other slide, I want to come back to this one. The second trip, the first trip we did with, interestingly enough, not with an Armenian group. It was with a Turkish colleague, and I always say that shows how much things have changed because, you know, up until, and I still am, Turks refer to me as dushman. I'm their enemy. And very recently, in the most recent website, by the way, someone just sent me yesterday, they accused me of organizing a plot to assassinate UCLA Professor Stanford Shaw, and they're very upset that I wasn't punished for that plot. So it shows that, you know, that still goes on. But what I want to say is that there have been a number of liberal and progressive Turkish scholars in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, I couldn't have thought of traveling to Turkey with a Turk. But I did that a few years ago, a person who acknowledges the genocide, and every summer has been traveling to the historic areas of Armenia to learn more about Armenian life there. And so that first trip was with them. The second trip was with the NAASR group. Ruben Berberian is here, and Ruben went out both on this trip and the one that we just completed. That one, I wanted to show you the map of where we went, and then come back and talk to you about it. Where are we? Look up at the top at Caesarea, Gesaria. That's Gesaria. And our trip started really not in Cilicia, but in Gesaria, in the very famous region known as Cappadocia, where Gregor the Illuminator was ordained as the first Catholicos of the Armenians, and where there are many, many Greek churches, Orthodox churches that are hewn, rock-hewn churches into the soft stone of places known as Urgu, Goreme, and then to Gesaria, and then you see down there Tomarza, we call it. We went on that journey around a big mountain that is known as Argios. The Armenians called it Argios, the Turks called it Ergias. And my Khanamis come from that area of Tomarza and Chomakhlu, which was near there. And they used to put out in Yetem, have you heard of Yetem? A little town in the San Joaquin Valley, the only Armenian town that was established by Armenians with an Armenian name in the United States, Anana Yetem. And the Chomakhlazis all came to Yetem in Tulare County, and they used to put out a periodical paper, Ba Piratert, Vorunanunir Argios. Its name was Argios, and I came to understand when I saw this that for them it was not Mount Ararat that had any importance. It was this mountain of 13,000 feet in elevation, and all the villages around there, Evereg-Fenese, Gesaria, Tomarza, they all saw that mountain. And then we went on down in the blue, our journey, and what we're going to see later on today, going down from the blue takes us to Hadjin, and from Hadjin to Sis, and from Sis to Adana, to Tarsus, to Mersin, to Selefke, to Korikos, back to Dortyol, where in 1909 the Hadjin party in particular was well organized there, and they defended themselves and are very proud of that defense, but they couldn't defend themselves in 1915. And then down to Antioch and Musa Dagh. And I want you to look at where Musa Dagh is, and look where Aleppo is. You'll understand why the Syrians up until today are really upset that that territory was stolen from them in the 1930s, as late as the 1930s, when the French rigged an election to allow the Turks to annex what is known as the Sanjak of Alexandretta in 1938, 1939, at which time most of the Musa Daghs left, went down to Lebanon and established a new town known as Aintab in the malaria flats, and very different climate, very different everything from Musa Dagh. But that's where we went finally. And then we went back up to Killis, which is right on the border with Syria, and up to Aintab, a beautiful city and a very interesting one, and finally up to Marash and Zeitun, which are up to the north. And third, next, let's go back to the other one. And the last journey we took began on the Black Sea, on the beautiful Black Sea coast, which is known as Bondos. And one of the last books that I edited was on Pontus. And it's really interesting. My editor says, Mazda Publishers, he says, your Harpert book is sold out. Your Cilicia book is almost sold out. Other books are, Van is sold out. Why doesn't anyone buy the Pontus book? And there's a good answer for that, because here in the United States we don't have a lot of Trabzonsis, Samsonsis, Ordutsis, Irasonsis, people from the area that comes from this region known as Bondo. Anyway, we started on this new trip. We just completed it from Samsun on the Black Sea, going to Marzovan, an important American missionary center, the heart, the site of Anatolia College, which when it was closed down by the Turks, transferred to Thessaloniki, Greece, and is still operating in Saloniki or Thessaloniki. And then to Tokat, to Marzovan, Amasya, which is probably the most beautiful city that I've seen in all of Turkey. And after Amasya to Tokat, Sivas, which is Sebastia. And as you know, there were scores of Armenian villages in the plain of Sebastia, on both banks of the river here. This was the birthplace of Daniel Varujan. We went to his village, Daniel Varujan's village, and a number of other, Govdun, which is a very important village. I don't know, those of you who know revolutionary history, I may have heard of the name of Murad, Medzin Murad. This was his birthplace as well. And then on from Sebastia in red, again back to Harpert now for me a third time, Malatya, Harpert. And very interesting then to Diyarbakir, where the Armenian church Subkiragos, which had totally collapsed, is now being renovated at the expense of the city of Diyarbakir. The Kurdish mayor is giving millions of dollars for the renovation of the church of Subkiragos, which will be reconsecrated this year. So, you know, it's a land of really contrast. And then down to, in the red, if you can see, almost to Syria, down to Mardin. And Mardin is a very interesting place because the local population still speaks Arabic. All of the population still speaks Arabic. Even the Armenians, they don't know Armenian. They know Turkish and they know Arabic. And all of the Armenians, there are only 10 families left, but there used to be several thousand Armenians in Mardin, and almost all of them were Armenian Catholics. And their Arachnort was tortured in the deportations of 1915. And I have very vivid descriptions of that torture. Those of you coming from Arabic countries know that when the women make this sound of, kind of thing, as the Armenians were being deported, all the Turkish and Muslim women were making that sound of victory for their heroes who were taking them. And this poor Armenian prelate then was taken and tortured to death. He is now being beatified by the Vatican. We met one Armenian boy here, whose name is Hovannisian. Very interesting boy. He speaks some English, he speaks a little Armenian. He opened the church for us there, and now we're going to see it very briefly, and sang the Sharagans in an almost angelic voice. I don't like the Constantinople, Istanbul Armenians. In truth, they're too Turkish, he said. They're too Turkish. They marry Turks. They want to become Turks. So he was, he says, I'm a Tashnag. And I said, well, why are you a Tashnag? And then later on over dinner, he says, I think you're a Hunchak, he said. I said, why do you think I'm a Hunchak? Because you asked me why I'm a Tashnag. anyway, so an interesting things. And then up to, back to Von one more time. So this is it. As in all my trips, well, up from Von, up in the red again, for the first time for me, to Bayazid and Igdir. Igdir is on the base of Mount Ararat, Kars and Ani. And I was very, very depressed in all this time. We're talking here about just Kars, Ani, and Igdir. We're talking about a territory that is twice the size of the current Republic of Armenia, and an area that was in the Republic of Armenia in 1920. Territory that was lost as late as 1920 in the Turkish invasion by Mustafa Kemal, the collapse of the Armenian army, the shameful collapse of the Armenian army at Kars, the Sovietization of Armenia, the reneging of promises by the Soviets that they would bring this territory back to Armenia. And as you probably know, in 1946, 1948, there was an attempt or a claim by the Soviets for these territories. And for me, it probably was the most frustrating and difficult to travel through the province of Kars with its rich, rich pastures and alfalfa and thousands and thousands and thousands of cows and dairy herds of all kinds that could have been a part of Armenia, that should have been a part of Armenia. And so these trips are all depressing and frustrating and raise a lot of questions. And there are always the contradictions everywhere, the friendliness of most of the population, but except in Erzurum and except in Igdir and places where they're really mean and look mean and look at you as, you know, you're a threat to them. But overall, friendliness, and at the same time, as it happened on my first trip, once again it happened on this trip in Tokat, when people learned that we were Armenians. The man said, "Oh, my grandfather lived in an Armenian house." In other words, they took it over. And we searched and we searched and we couldn't find the treasure. Where is the treasure? We heard, he said, we heard that there is a map in the United States that shows where it is. So if you will bring it, we will share it with you. And then he even offered 70%. He would keep only 30%. So, you know, this kind of thing is still going on 100 years after the fact, still digging. Every single church ruined has a hole of 20 feet, 30 feet where they've dug to find the treasures. And I'm sure they found them, because where is the poor priest going to put his treasures except to bury them, you know? And they're still looking. Well, I'm going to try to do two things and do it fast, so, you know, it's going to be click, click, click. But I wasn't going to show you this, but since I just returned, I want to just give you a glimpse. My very poor photography, Ruben Berberian, I don't know if you know him, who is here, is really a professional one. He's going to flinch at how bad these pictures are, because he has some wonderful ones, and I hope that we'll see those someday. But in the meantime, I just want to start you off on the, at Constantinople in Istanbul for one slide. We visited we can go transfer now to the cemetery. Next. Well, we're going to start out, yeah, we can start, there we go. This was Hrant Dink, the last time I saw him alive in the Agos offices, and here in the Armenian cemetery near the Armenian National Hospital, Askani Vantanatsimod, Hrant Dinki Shirim, here, it's kept well. And next, the Patriarchal Church, next. And now we're in Samson. I wonder, can we lower half of the alliance or not? Yeah. Just half of it. Well, all right, here we are in Samsun. Look, 500,000 people, Samsun. Samsun is important in Armenian American history because all the Armenian immigrants who came from Kharper, who came from Sepastia, who came from all these areas, always went to Samsun, and from Samsun they took the boat over to Istanbul or Constantinople, and then another boat to Marseille, and from Marseille to Ellis Island or so forth. Now largely here, let's go back. Here they are. Look at no. Here you see the old Armenian quarter up. Always the Armenian quarters are way up high. You have a beautiful view of the sea, but you can see what's happened to the homes, but now they're being renovated. Next. Here you see a renovated Armenian house. Next. We've gone now to Marzovan, 53,000. Look to the right. Those are opium poppies everywhere. They're being grown. Next. And here is a part of Anatolia College, the American Missionary College in Marzovan, or Merzifon. Next. One of the Armenian churches that remains, I believe, was the Catholic Church of Marzovan. Next. Here is the Armenian the Armenian Protestant Church that was opened only in 1914. In other words, the poor Armenian Protestants spent all that money, and within a few months they were deported and never were able to use it. Fortunately, it was used as a theater for a long time, and that's why the building is still there. Next. This is the backside of the backside of the Armenian church. You can't see anything else because it's now used as a wedding reception hall, and so you can come in the other way. You can see it's all covered up, but the building, you can see it was a very large church, and this is Marzovan. Next. Marzovan, next. It was raining. Next. Here, we've gone to a village about 15 miles away from Marzovan, Gumush Hachikoy, and the only Armenian. You know, this is what's so depressing. You find an Armenian, you find like, oh, a great discovery. I mean, as if, you know, this is a land of Armenia. And you find one Armenian and you feel like you found a great discovery. And here is the one Armenian showing Armenian inscriptions that have been whitewashed there. And he showed us where the Armenian church was that had been torn down in the 1930s and 40s. So churches are being torn down all the time, not just in 1915, continuously thereafter. Next. Amasya, as I say, I think was the most beautiful site. 99,000, 100,000 people. Next. Here you see it along the river. These are all Armenian homes. All of these where the Armenians lived were right on the river at Amasya. Next. Here you see the city from above with the red tile roofs on both sides, and the Halis River going, I think it's the Yeshil Irmak that goes through the city. Next. Tokat. This is Armenian Yevdovkia, the important center. Next. The fortress. Next. Here you see an Armenian inscription down by the museum. There are a few tombstones. And here is one, and there's even one tombstone in English. That is the little Armenian girl, 2 years old, adopted by an American missionary. And her tombstone is here in English. Interesting. Next. Sepastia is Sivas, 300,000 people. Cities are growing. Next. Next, this is out of place. This is the modern city of Sepastia, or Sivas. Next. We've come now to Pyurk. Pyurk was the birthplace of Daniel Varjan, and this is the church of that village. I'm sorry? Berkeley. Next. Govdun. Govdun is down along the river, and here you see the church of Govdun. It stands now in beautiful fields, but inside is a ahor, is a stable. Next. Here you see the alfalfa. And you can understand why it was Govdun, if that's what the word comes from. You know, cow house, because there was just cattle everywhere here. Next. and a bridge that was supposed to have been, this is the Halis River, that was supposed to have been built by Armenians. Next. Next. My tech person didn't, some of these are turned around. This was the Armenian church of the village of Ishkhan in Sebastian. Next. Yurin used to be a very important Armenian center of lacework and shawls. Armenians were famous for trading shawls. There's nothing left. It's now a small village. Next. This is the region of Yurin. Next. The Armenian Church of Yurin. Next. Malatya. Next. The Armenian Church of Holy Trinity. The Philadelphia Malatyatzis have named their church Holy Trinity in memory of this church, which there are rumors that maybe the Turkish government will be renewing. Maybe. Next. And this is from the Armenian monastery of St. Gregory, Sukrikor, Sebastian. Next. Here's the monastery. It was a place where for pilgrimages. And interesting enough, Holy Trinity is the diocese church in Philadelphia, and St. Gregory's is the prelacy church. So the Malatyatzis each got their church in Philadelphia. Next. Next. This is the Armenian Protestant Church. Look how large it was in Elazığ, in Kharpert. The Armenian Apostolic Church, nothing is left of it. The Assyrians, the Asoris, have a small chapel. Next. This is my mother's village of Kesari, where they have pided. They have a pided bakery. Next. And you see the man showing the size of the gaha of the local is saying our cabbage gets this big. Next. And you probably see women who probably were born or may have been born as Armenians, who are now Kurds living in the villages of Kharpert. Next. Madin is an area where there's a great deal of mining on the way to Dikranagir. Next. This is Madin. Next. And you can't see it. If you turn around, you can see the mines where there was a great deal of mining industry there, where the workers were Armenians and Greeks and the all gone. Next. Chumkush. Chumkush is, again, an Armenian town in the region of Dikranagir. The population has gone down to 2,500. The road ends here. There's nowhere you can go. After you come to Chumkush, it's a dead end. Next. This is the church of Surpas Vazazin, the shell of it remaining in Chumkush. Next. And this is where they brought all the men from Chumkush, about 4 miles away from the town, and they killed them and dumped them into this pit. It was like, you've seen pictures of the Holocaust where people dig their own graves and then are shot. And this is famous, that several thousand Armenian men and boys were killed and dumped into this great pit. Next. Diyarbakir, all Kurdish, 800,000 people, maybe 900,000 now, of whom, if you say 840,000, more than 800,000 of those are Kurdish. Next. See the walls, the famous black basalt walls from Byzantine times of Diyarbakir. They're about 3 miles around the city of Dikranagir. Next. Next. Here you see the church of Surkiragos is being repaired. The roof is now back on. The columns are being fortified. And as I say, very soon they will have the first religious ceremony, probably even before it's completed here. And this is maybe a way that the Kurds are making a gesture to the Armenians, saying that they always insist that we suffered, Armenians suffered in 1915, now it's our turn, they're saying. And so it's a sense of we're both victims of the Turkish government. Next. You can see it's a famous church, Yota Khoranov. Yota Khoranov, you've shot parts of what we call a bell tower. it's Zankagadu. And seven altars in this church of Surkirakos. Next. Here is Hovannisian, my Tashnag friend of Mardi, 20 years old, and has told me that when he had time to get married, he said, I would never marry anyone besides an Armenian. I said, well, where are you going to find someone? He says, I'm going to go across the border to Chomakhlu. Chomakhlu is in northern Syria. There are Kurdish-speaking Armenians there. He knows Kurdish, he knows Turkish, and he knows Arabic, as do the Chomakhlu girls. And I said, will they come back with you and live with you? Oh, yes, he said, they'll come. Next. Here you see the streets of the area. Next. The Tigris River. Next. This Mardin again. Next. Next. Here you see the picture of the bishop who was martyred in 1915 in the Armenian Catholic Church. I believe the name is of St. Joseph Church. Next. Here he is. Next. And the group singing sharagans in the Armenian Catholic Church, where there are only about 15 Armenians left in the city. Next. Please. Next. Famous, the Bitlis is in a vale, and the houses are built up on a hillside. This is, as you know, William Saroyan country. Next. Armenian Church, one of the 7 churches of Bitlis, all in ruins. Next. And another one. Next. And now in Van, the great rock, the Artuan fortress of Van. Next. Next. Maheri Dura, a famous Sasun David epic of the 4th Pokar Maher, was supposed to have gone into the cave and one day will emerge to bring emancipation and liberty or whatever else you want him to bring. Next. And the local Kurdish children. Here a Kurdish man approached us and said, why doesn't the Americans help us? And someone said, well, the Americans are giving you billions of dollars. He says, no. Why did he help us Kurds? He said, next. Here we are at Lake Van. Next. Tamar with the cross on it. Next. Inside, the scaffolding is gone. When I saw it last, I said scaffolding. Next. Surpkach. Next. And now we're in Igdir. Igdir was a part of the Armenian Republic in 1920. It was the birthplace of Avedi Saharonian, and I asked the person, where is Igdir Mava, which is a district of Kars, of Igdir. The person knew and brought it, and you see all the old Russian-style construction here in Kars, and so all these buildings are done in the 19th century Russian style. If you've come from Yerevan and look at the old buildings in Yerevan, Shadnamanachunga in Yerevani Yavashikirimicha Igdir Lora, which was never in Turkey. It was always a part of Yerevan province. With Mount Ararat, it was a part of the Persian Empire, and then a part of the Russian Empire, and a part of the swap that Lenin and Mustafa Kemal did was Igdir went to Turkey in exchange for Batum going to Soviet Georgia. And so this is it. Next. 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 Here in Kars, we're in Kars, you see the Russian Orthodox Church that has been converted to a mosque. Next. And the Russian-style buildings of Kars. Next. The Great Friendship Monument that was just being torn down. There was this big monument that, you know, Erdogan, the current Prime Minister, called it an abomination and needed to go.
because he's appealing to the nationalistic sentiment of the eastern province Turks, who are still very anti-Armenian and fearful still that there someday someone will try to make a play for their lands. Next. Here is Kars. Next. The fortress, the great fortress, which on October 30th, 1920, the Armenians abandoned shamefully to the Turks and retreated in their great defeat. Next. The Arakilosi, the Church of the Holy Apostles, 10th century church of 10th or 11th, I think, of Surparakilos. Now we're at Ani, and you can see all the greenery here. On the other side is Armenia, and you see the Church of the Redeemer, Aminaparagich, I believe, is that church there. Next. I think I made a mistake here. Let's go back and take a look at that. Well, it's out of order, I'm sorry. Next. Next. Here we have the Mother Cathedral that is being reinforced, and one of the great problems is that right across the Ahurian River, the Armenians are quarrying tufa rock, and you have a continuous vibration from the Armenian side. Next. Look at that. These are 11th century Gothic style architecture. Dortyol, the great architect who repaired the dome of Hagia Sophia, was the architect for this great monument. Next. Out of place, but here near the Patriarchate, one of the candidates had a sign which was sort of surprising. Voch meg Aden Ksanachors Abril. In other words, never again, April 24th, and that's in the Armenian quarter of Istanbul. It's out of place here. Next. And here you see the Ahurian River, the ARPA, separating Ani on this side from, you can see even the stone quarries of Armenia on the other side. This was a bridge here. Next. We're now in Sarıkamış, going toward Erzurum. In Sarıkamış, in the end of 1914, Enver Pasha took an army of 100,000 men. They suffered 70,000 casualties because of his stupidity, and could have been one of the triggers for the Armenian genocide because they scapegoated the Armenians for that. And here is a monument to the men who sacrificed their lives at Sarıkamış. Next. Next. And look, this is again, was in the Armenian Republic, 1920. Forests, lumber, timber, great stands of it, all lost. And therefore I say, very depressing and frustrating to be in this area. Next. Next. And finally, we concluded our rapid run here to Erzurum. Again, nearly 400,000 people. In 1915, it was barely 30,000 people. Next. This is a building that looks like the Sanasaryan Cemaran. We're not sure, but different speculations. Next. Now we've gone to Vartiter's father's house in the village of Sitoh. Sitoh is about 10 miles to the north of Erzurum, where there was the plain Garnotashta, Garin. The Armenians call it Garin. My grandson is named Garin for Erzurum. And this is her father's house, although it's been converted now to a stable. Next. Next. And look at the hotels they built. This is the hotel where we stayed in Erzurum, 4-star, 5-star, and these hotels are all over Turkey. Envy at the infrastructure, the roads, continuous building of roads, 4-lane, 6-lane, and they understand that politically it's very important to link all the Kurdish areas by good highways with the rest of the country, both for their, whatever purposes you would understand. So here we are, concluding in Erzurum. Next. And finally, back in Istanbul, I started with Hrant Dink's memorial, and to the left is Hrant Dink's daughter. And she is now the head of Hrant Dink Foundation, Vakf in Istanbul. And the man with the beard is Baron Seropian, who is the Armenian editor of Hrant Dink's newspaper, Agos. Next. That's okay, that's the first part. Now, I wasn't going to show this, but I needed to show it since I just came back and I wanted to share with you here my sentiments and probably still a degree of confusion as to what goes on. And anger and frustration, envy, all of them go together. And with 15 and 20 million Kurdish population living in the Armenian lands, where do we go from here? I don't have the answer to that. Now we're going to go to what I originally intended to show you. And again, I'm going to do it rather rapidly, and we're going to go to starting Gesaria, and we're going to go down and end up in Marash. So let's go on now to the second part. Hi. If you have a question while he's setting up, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Sir?
Yes.
In the cities, after the population, underneath there is another figure.
It's
What's
elevation.
that?
Elevation in meters.
Ah, okay.
Elevation in meters, and you see that most of them say 1,800 meters to 1,500 meters. And we're talking about an Armenian highland. We say the Armenian highland. That's the Armenian highland because it's 4,000 feet, 5,000 feet in elevation. It's like Denver, Colorado. You're the plains. We're at the same elevation of Agagat Barsavantak. Anything else? Yes.
What is the truth you said about here and the other area that are now, you said that we're standing here and the president also presses us and belongs.
What is the what?
The provinces that are bordering today's Armenia,
Yes.
Irania and so on.
Yeah.
You said that now they were given the lost in 1920.
Yes.
Now my question is, the Alexandra-Bol Treaty,
Yes.
what is your truth about it? What is the truth about Alexandra-Bol
Oh well.
Treaty? No, just a simple question.
Yeah.
And whether whoever signed it, were they mandated, were they legitimate representative of our people? Is that where we lost those lands?
That's where it started. I've written extensively about that in volume 4 of my Republic of Armenia, and I refer you to that. The Treaty of Alexandropol is very, very complex and controversial. It was never ratified, but it did set the basis for the treaties of Moscow and Kars that followed in 1921 between the Soviets. The problem or the issue, and I don't want to get deeply into this if we're ready to go, is that when the Armenian government in 1920 signed over to the Soviets in a peaceful transfer of power, the treaty that was signed between the Soviet representatives and the Armenian representatives, who were represented by Dro and Derderian for the Armenian government, was that if Armenia peacefully accepted Soviet rule, the Soviet side would see to it that the borders of the Republic of Armenia, as they had existed before the Turkish invasion, would be reestablished. In other words, that they would pressure the Turks to withdraw. Obviously, that didn't happen. Lenin and Stalin and Chicherin were dealing with Mustafa Kemal, who was a much smarter and much more clever diplomat and manipulator than they. But that's one of these days we should have maybe a seminar on Alexandropol, Kars, and Moscow, because those are indeed, they're all linked. And you probably know that Shahan Natali, who was a former ARF bureau member, has written scathingly criticizing the Russian Armenian comrades for that treaty. That's all I can tell you. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but that's where we are. All right, now we're going to go on to what I intentionally wanted to show, and because the time is going on, I'm going to be rather rapid. I've already talked about it. Now, I want to say this, but I guess after 3 trips, I'm enriched, we're enriched, we're educated. It's good we did it after so many years of not wanting to do it because I didn't want to see what knew I was going to see. But at the same time, I'm a deep sense of being forlorn and wondering whatever can be done. Because it is a vanishing landscape to this day. If we have a church that's renewed in Achtamar and one in Dikranagir, other Timatsa Haruravuri gets in the Khamdavin, Dagavin, Yevterimus. So it's, let's just. Here we start again in the Bosphorus, beautiful Bosphorus. Istanbul is one of the most beautiful cities of the world, as you know. Next. Next. This was the journey that we did on the first trip. Next. And if you look at this map here, you'll see Ankara, and today, and then Yozgat. Between those areas, we're coming to Gesaria. Next. Here we are in that area of these stone formations in Cappadocia. Next. Already, this was 2 years ago, when increasingly young Turkish girls were covering up. And when I went to Turkey years ago, I never saw a young Turkish girl with their heads covered. But today in Istanbul, more than half of the women are covering their heads. So you can find the religious identity is very, very strong. And in the interior provinces, it's 90% they're covered, 90%. Also because a great deal of pressure. If they don't cover up, they're going to get a lot of not nice words. Next. 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 Here you see the churches that are hewn into the natural formations of Cappadocia. Next. Next. Greek Orthodox churches inside the caves. Next. And here we are at Urgut, and going on towards Kayseri, Gesaria. Next. This is the Armenian church, Shurprikor Lusavoric, Gesario. It's famous because it has the name of the enlightener, illuminator of Armenia. It's in the oldest section of the city. Whenever we want to find anything Armenian, we have to go to the oldest quarter, because the new city is mushroomed all around it. Next. Here, the courtyard of the church. Next. Next. Inside was being renovated by 2 Gesaratsi brothers living in Istanbul. Next. Next. You see one of the schools, Sarkis Gülşen Varjaran, 1868. The school was right next to the church. Next. And these are the people living around the church now. These are gypsies, Poshanere, living around the church. Next. These are the old Armenian quarter. Interesting, again, contradictions. The city now is creating like a historic zone to preserve some of these old Armenian houses. So on the one hand, you know, you have destruction going on. On the other hand, some people are trying to preserve a little bit of their history. Next. You can see renovation or the restoration project of the Armenian quarter. Next. Now we go up above Gesaria on the beautiful hamlet village of Talas. Talas is famous for the American Missionary School. In Talas, many Armenian intellectuals have gone here as well. And there's the American school. Now you see Gesaria from Talas. It was an entirely Armenian village and overlooking the city. Next. Here you see Ergies, that's Argios, and you see the bottom of the mountain. You'll see more of it next. Here you have, this is Argios, the famous Ergies mountain, which is the central focal point where you can see it 50 miles away from all sides. Next. It reminds me of a Sarian kind of painting, doesn't it? Next. This is Evereg-Fenese. These are twin towns, and this was the church of Taurus, Theodore. And you can see it's been converted to a mosque. The minaret is there, but the church and all the inscriptions around it are in Armenian. Next. You see, in the wall of the church, they have these stones with the Armenian writing. Next. Inside the church, in all the Armenian churches that have been converted to mosques, you'll look at the Khoram, the altar, which is always empty because it faces toward the rising sun. But the Muslims pray toward Mecca. And if you see on the right side, the khutbah, where they bow down, they're going to be facing to your right, not straight ahead. Now look way up to the front. One of the caretakers is lifting up a wooden plank. They have whitewashed this church. They had a lot of frescoes. This one particular fresco, they whitewashed so many times, but it still came out from the white. And they thought that the asfaltzarat, so instead of trying to whitewash it anymore, they covered it with a piece of wood. But they're not shy to show it to us. Next. Here you can see the part of the fresco that that's in the church. Next. The Armenian quarter of Evereg. Next. And the key to one of the Armenian houses. The last Armenian died here 2 or 3 years ago. The rest of them have gone to Istanbul from all over Anatolia. The remaining Armenians go to Istanbul. And that's why when you go to the Armenian Patriarchate, you can hear only Turkish. They don't know Armenian, but they're identify as Armenians and they're strong Christians. Interesting. Next. Next. This is my Khanami's village, which is probably the poorest, and we're talking about contradictions. The villages that we visited, even on this trip, they are so poor. You think that they're living 100 years ago. I mean, nothing has changed in 100 years. Maybe electricity, but everywhere is manure, filth, dirt, and so forth. But right next to that are these booming 5-star hotels, huge cities, a great road building that's going on, and then this contradiction is all over the place. Next. And this is the village of Chomakhlu. These are all the people from Yetem in Selefke Valley are all from this village. Next. Next. Here's one of the Armenian churches. You see the gamar, the arch of the church. It's filthy. It has lost in about 3 feet of watery manure inside. Next. And the dung that they dry for heating in the winter. Next. Next. And you see here the Armenian writing on the walls, helter-skelter. Next. Next. Now we are leaving Gesaria and approaching Davros, the Taurus Mountains. And those Taurus Mountains separate Anatolia from Cilicia, from Cilicia. We're now approaching the Taurus. Next. Taurus is regarded historically as the southern limits of the Armenian plateau, the Armenian highland. And as you probably know, the Armenians went beyond the Taurus to create an Armenian state known as Cilicia, the Armenian Principality and Kingdom of Cilicia, that existed from the 11th century through the 14th century. For 300 years, the Armenians dominated this region of Cilicia, and they lived there uninterruptedly until the genocide. Next. This is the road now, the back road going toward Hadjin. Next. This is the vale toward Hadjin. Hadjin is down at the bottom of this road. Next. It's now known as Saim Beyli. It has only 4,000 people. In 1915, it had nearly 30,000 people. You know, some of you know Diana Hekimian and you know Armin Arayan. Next. This is the village, a sleepy village now. Next. The Armenian girls' school of Hadjin, built only in 1912. So the girls had started going to school for 2 years when the end for these people came. Now Hadjin has a special history like Marash does, because after the genocide, the survivors returned to Hadjin in 1919. And they thought that they would be protected by the French, who occupied parts of Cilicia in 1919. But they were abandoned and left to their own resources. And the first place where the Turks, Mustafa Kemal, tried to demonstrate his superiority or his victory was at Hadjin and in Marash. And they surrounded Hadjin, and the Armenian survivors here resisted from February of 1920 until October. I mean, for nearly 9 months until they were finally overrun. And those of you who know the priest in San Diego, Der Tatev, I don't know if you know Der Tatev Tatulia, his mother was famous, not famous, but noted, because she lived here in Southern California, and she lived her entire life with a bullet in her heart, because they had shot her, but she hadn't died. And she lived with that bullet. They couldn't operate on her. So Hadjin has a double tragedy, and they're also, you know, they call it Heroskava, Gevordeviskavis, Baikaretsan, Gervetsan, Menchevechi Pampush. Xantabaga, Woshtidasting. Next. 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 We're now in Sis. Sis, as you probably know, was the last capital, not the first, but the last capital of the Cilician Armenian Kingdom. It was here that Levon Tagavor and his successors ruled from this highland fortress. Next. This was the Catholicosate of Saint Sophia, Sub Sophiae, Mair Yekiratsiver, the center of the Catholicosate of Cilicia. And the last Catholicos here was Sahak Catholicos Chabayan, Acharpertzi. And fortunately, when he was exiled and when the monks were exiled, they were able to take not most, but a great deal of their treasures out with them. And they are now ended up in the museum in Antilias. There's at the Armenian monastery in Antilias. Many of the treasures from this church. But the church is totally gone, almost totally gone. I want to show it to you now. Next. Here it is. What it was and what it became. Next. And one of the apses. Next. And parts of the walls. Next. Now going up toward the fortress, which is like 3,000 or 4,000 feet above the city. And you can understand the defensive importance of it. Next. And look how thick the walls are, going from the outside of the fortress to the interior. It was thick enough, wide enough to have stables and places to live, etc., within the walls of the fortress. Next. Here you are, look at on top of the Sis fortress, and look at the plain of Sis below. Next. I have, that picture you just saw was, that's right, what happened? That's the one I have on my book on Cilicia. I chose that one, and we'll see if we can continue now. We're going to wait a minute. All right. It's interesting what the internet does, because when we were in Hadjin, at a gas station owner came out and took us inside, and he was looking at the internet, and he's read everything about the Armenians in Hadjin, and he was apologetic. He says, "I'm teaching my son what happened here." Do you believe them? I hope so. Well, looks like we're going to start over. Yeah. All right. We have a quick refresher here. If you didn't look closely, you'll do it again. You have a question? Or a comment? Yes?
When are you going back, and are you taking people with you?
I don't think I'm going back, but you know, after my first trip, I said I'll never go back either. And it's something like when I go to Armenia, I say, and then you come back, and about 6 months later, you start saying, well, maybe I have to go again. Are we there? All right, next. Let's hope it works. So, Armenian Armenian does a great service by organizing the groups, and he tailor-makes the tours to places where people have been. For example, on the group that we just went with, we have a couple from Palu who wanted to see her village, someone whose father came from the village of Hore in Kharpert, someone from Hin Akarak. And for them, it's a very emotional moment to go back to their parents' village. And at the same time, it's also very depressing, because the villages are so poor that they feel really very bad about it. Can we go on, or we cannot go on? Huh? I can't hear you. Ruben, you know how to do this?
I'm not a Mac person.
Ruben, are you here?
I'm here, but I'm not a Mac person.
No, you don't know how to do it? Say it again. No, I didn't go to any of the type. Lambron was there, but we didn't go through them. What we did, we went to Vakhta, which was where the first center of the Armenian Ruben was in 1080, and then down after Sis to Adana, and Adana to Mersin. I don't know if it's difficult. I don't know if it's difficult Lambron. Lambron, of course, was a major fortress of the house of Lambron Nazi, but we didn't do that. Will the other one work, the flash, or no? Why don't you turn the light on? We can have a little discussion if we need to while we're waiting. I hope it will work. Yeah. Something you want to ask further? Yeah.
When you went to Sis, to the fortress, when you went to Sis, did you go in the back of it? Did you see any pomegranate and apricot trees?
Did we see apricot trees? I didn't.
Huge trees.
We didn't see. There probably were pomegranate trees up there, and there were a couple of trees. But around Sis were multiple orchards of every kind of fruit. And it was interesting because I was sitting next to the driver, and because I grew up in the Selefke Valley, I was able to identify just by their leaves nearly every kind of thing. And then there was one thing, a plant, and he pointed to it. He says, "Meh, what is it?" And I guessed, and I was right. And I said, we called it shushma. You know what shushma is? Sesame. And I said, tahin. Oh, happy.
By the way, if you know,
And we didn't see any snakes either. You know, the Sis is famous for its snakks.
to Kulakyu. I'm from Tarsus. My
Kulakyu, yes. Kulakyu had a wonderful monastery.
The church was in the shambles next to the mulberry.
The monastery is still there, although there's some vandalism that's taken place recently. But Kulakyu, your neighbors with Buzmashim. Yeah.
Since Cilicia was a state outside of traditional Armenia, what kind of claim heritage?
What kind of?
What kind of claims are there to our heritage there?
All right. Well, we've okay. We're afraid to go back one. All right, don't touch it. See if you go back one, what happens. All right. In Adana, we had to go to the oldest quarter of Adana. Adana is now a city of 3 million people, at least. It is the third largest city in Turkey. It's where all the American air bases, the Incirlik air base is nearby. It's where the Sabancı family made its fortune on Armenian properties that were stolen from the Armenians in this region. And here we had to go to the oldest quarter to find a few Armenian buildings, including this clock tower that was built by 2 Armenian brothers in the old city of Adana. And the next picture I'm going to show you is a picture of Adana in 1909. You see the same clock tower and Armenian churches. Next. Now this is what happened after 1909, the massacres of Adana in 1909, where the whole city was burned. And as you know, some 30,000 Armenians died in the Adana massacres, or the Cilicia massacres. And probably those who suffered the most were the Protestants, because they had the misfortune. There were 2 waves of massacres in 1909. The second wave, when they thought things were calm, the Protestant pastors of all the region were gathering together in Adana for their annual meeting. And so they were wiped out. It was really bad in 1909. Next. Here you see the river, and look at that mosque, newly built by the Sabancı family, multi-billionaires, and they wanted to build a mosque in Adana that would rival the prettiest mosque of Istanbul. And so they built this huge mosque with great parks around it. Next. While you're doing that, going back to the question of what claims the Armenians have to Cilicia, good question. Armenians have lived there from long before the Cilician kingdom, and I guess they have the same claims as any other group. It was an area of mixed population always: Greek, Arab, Turkish, Kurdish, Asuri, Ansari, different groups of people. They lived there for 3 centuries as the dominant group, and then after the Ottoman Empire annexed the area in the 16th century, they lived there as a significant minority. In 1919, when the Armenians went to Paris, they made the economic argument for the need of Cilicia, of the Republic of Armenia, the new Republic of Armenia, for an exit to the Mediterranean Sea. So they had economic, historical, and other kinds of claims, and said that no one is a majority here. They're just, we are a plurality, and we should have this area, and in time it will very quickly become entirely Armenianized. And of course that did not work out. The area was abandoned by the French, given back to the Turks, and so the claim remains a claim. And even in 1920, when they drew the boundaries of the new Republic of Armenia, at the Treaty of Sèvres, they did not include any part of Cilicia in that treaty. they were hoping that they would make it into a national, what they referred to as an ocak, hearth, a national home where Armenians could gather under Turkish rule. This is Mersin. Look at the Hilton Hotel. Yamina Khansik. Next. Selefke. Selefke is way out. It's about 50 miles to the west of Mersin. And Selefke was all a part of the kingdom of Levon I. I understand that I had never met a Selefketsi, but I understand there are quite a number of them in Cyprus, because it's right across the straits from Cyprus. And so in 1915, many of the Selefketsis and thereafter got across the water to 1920, and are still living. Their descendants are still living in Cyprus. Anything else? I didn't get to Urfa. We got near Urfa as far as Rumkla, which is not far from Urfa, but if I ever return, that will be a place where I have to return. I did, with this last trip that we took, I did get through the remainder of the 6 Armenian vilayets. I had not been to Dikranagir, Diyarbakir, so I was able to do that, and I had not been to Kars and Ani, and I was able to do that. And it was interesting that while we were in Kars, this last volume of mine that I've edited on Kars and Ani was issued while I was right there. So it was a sort of an irony that I was sitting in Kars and Ani, and the first book arrived at my house from the publisher. Yes.
After the First World War, during the French Mandate, Cilicia declared independence.
Yes.
I even have some stamps pressed on it with Cilicia. Does it have any value or any substance to it, or any jurisdiction?
The Armenian National Council, along with Greeks, Assyrians, in an act of desperation with Miran Damadyan, who was at that time, I think he was still a Hanchagyan, maybe he was not then a Ramgavar. Damadyan was first a Hanchagyan, and then he became a Ramgavar. Leader, very dynamic individual, and he represented Boghos Numar Pasha in Cilicia, along with others. And when the French were already negotiating with Mustafa Kemal to give up Cilicia to the French, in an act of desperation in Adana, they declared Cilicia an independent state. But I mean, that had no didn't last for a week even. The French squashed that, dispersed it, and as I say, it was an act of desperation because they didn't know what else to do at the time. The French, whom they had wanted so desperately to support them, were betraying them, and the Americans under Woodrow Wilson, who made all these wonderful comments and so forth, that had done nothing to help. And so they declared the independence. They may have issued even, you said a commemorative stamp. That's possible. They did that as well. But it didn't. They did resist. Aintab, for example, as you probably know, in 1920-21 did. All right, let's hurry on so we don't lose these. This is Selefke. Next. Korikos, the island fortress of Korikos, the Levon I, and it has 2 fortresses, one in the sea, Mediterranean Sea, and one here. You can understand why Armenians desperately wanted this sea. As I write on my books when I Magakareltan, Cilicia, the Armenian window to the world. And indeed, Cilicia was the Armenian window to the world. Next. Musa. Here's the fortress of Korikos inside. They're now having summer concerts here. Next. You see the Greek inscriptions, and there are Armenian inscriptions as well. Next. Cross. Next. Now we're in Tarsus, And this is the American St. Paul's Academy of Tarsus that has now been given to the Turkish private ownership and is an American high school. When I went in and asked about Christie and other important missionaries there, they acted like they had never heard anything about it, and they didn't recognize the name St. Paul, which I don't believe either. Next. You can see Americans, American missionaries had certain kind of architecture. And this is very, very typical of the American missionary institutions in Turkey. Central Anatolia College, was it Aintab, I believe? And various seminaries. Next. Here is one of the churches of Tarsus. This is where Levon Takavod, not this church, but in Tarsus, was crowned the king of Armenia, recognized by the papacy, by the European powers, and by the Byzantine Empire here. And taking on, going back to your question, it's from this period the Armenians took on a lot of European ways. I think even the title of Baron comes from the Cilician period of coming from Baron. Next. Next. Here you can see the church and the minaret. Church, cuppet, and minaret. Next. Next. And again, I've said this before, but wherever we went, the sounds and the smells and the food are so familiar to us. More familiar to me than when I go to Yerevan, because these are the foods we grew up on, and we recognize them, the smells and the sounds and the music, everything. Next. Killis, one of the fortresses, and one of the things I recently discovered by one of the chapters of my Cilicia book, I don't know if there are any left there, is written by Edwards. And he tells us that the Armenians had a very distinct style of architecture, which he describes, and that these fortresses, which were 10 or 15 miles from each other, were able to keep in communication with each other without the telegraph by using mirrors. They used reflectors to communicate with one another. We've seen the old movies with the Indian smoke signals, and the Armenian defenders were communicating with each other by reflector mirrors. Next. We're now in Dortyol. As I told you, this was a place where the Doltrotsi, they call it Chort Marzban in Armenian, where the villagers were able to defend themselves in 1909, but 1915. And it's a place particularly where the Hadjin party is proud of their presence here. Next. Next. All there is inside of the flowers, at least you have flowers inside the decaying walls. And now we're in Antioch, very close to Haleb. Due east is Haleb, less than 2 hours by car to Aleppo. And many of the Aleppo Armenians used to come here for their summer vacations here and particularly nearby to Musa Dagh. Next. And here we are in Musa Dagh, famous Musa Dagh. For me, for years I've read about Musa Dagh, I've taught about Musa Dagh, and yet I could not imagine what it looked like. I hadn't seen pictures, and I imagined it something like the California foothills, which are sort of dry, scrawny grass, shrubs. But look at it, greenery, and this is the village of Bitias, was an important resort area also for the Aleppo Armenians. Bitias, next. Lost in trees. This next. The Armenian Apostolic Church. The Armenian Protestant Church is converted to a mosque. Next. Now remember, this was under Armenian control up until 1938, 1939. It's not 1915. Yes, they were deported. Yes, they did defend, but they stayed here until the 1930s. They continued to have their Hedisa and so forth here for years. Next. The Apostolic Church. Next. 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 Now we're in the village of Ulunozuk. Is that how we say it? Ulunozuk. Yohun Uluk. This is Yohun Uluk is the Derbedrosin family's birthplace before they went to Haleb, and where, as you know, Levon Derbedrosin's roots come from. Next. Unlike other places where the churches have been converted, in this village, the mosque is built on top of the church, and the church is still there underneath. Next. Next. Here is the, underneath the mosque are the remnants of the Armenian church of the village. Next. And you see the inscriptions. Next. And Sajihats, which is something we all recognize, right? Tonidihats. Next. This is Khadrbek, a famous tree. Musa Dagh all know this tree. It's been there probably for several hundred years, and everybody that's anybody has been photographed in front of that tree, going back to, you know, a very, very long time. It's a famous old tree, Khadrbek. Next. Now we're in the only remaining Armenian village in all of Turkey. In one of the Musa Dagh villages, there are 6 villages. We got the 4 of them. This is the 4th one we went to. It's Vakif. And in Vakif, there are probably no more than 30 homes, probably no more than 100 people or so, and most of them old, because the young people have moved out. But they've recently built a new church. This is their church, where they have a visiting priest that comes from Istanbul once or twice a year, and where they continue to have their Herisa festivals. Next. Here's inside their church. And this is the houses of Vakif. And 2 of the local women with one of our Dikranagirtsi friends from New Jersey. This is the mountain, Musalera. And it's on this mountain where the defenders went up to defend for their 40-some-odd days. Not 40 days, but 40-some-odd days, or closer to 50 days. But as you know, 40 has a special biblical meaning, and so we made it the 40 days. Next. And they came down on the other side of the mountain where the French vessel picked them up. And they probably came down this side. And if you look at the mountain on the other, in the distance, right beyond that mountain is Kesa. That's the border between Syria and Turkey. And just on the other side, as you probably know, the Turkish border goes right up to the border, and even some of the fields of Kesa were on the Turkish side, and the other remains on the other side. Next. They probably came down this way. Next. Next. And here you see Musa Dagh at sunset from Antioch. And one of the Orthodox churches, or the next. We're now, this area known as Sanjak, it included Alexandretta, or Iskenderun. It included, I think, Beylan, and a number of other towns. I'm not sure Beylan was in it, but I think it was. And this was a place known as Kırıkhan. And as you can see, the church remains. It still belongs to the Armenian Patriarchate in Constantinople or Istanbul, but they're afraid to touch it because of the hostility that it would arouse. Next. This is the church of Kırıkhan. Those of you who know Etchmiadzin history pretty well, it's the birthplace of an Arashnot by the name of Nerses Bozabalyan, who was the, I think, the Lusar Arabed, is that right? Yeah. Of Etchmiadzin. This is his birthplace. Now we're in Killis, right on the border. In 1920, the first treaty, it was on the Syrian side, and then in the later treaties by Lausanne, it became permanently on the Turkish side. It's just 2 miles from the border. And look at the Çağlayan mansion. This is the Çağlayan mansion of Killis Trade School. Next. This was the church of Killis. Next. And now we're in Aintab, beautiful Aintab, a beautiful church. This is the Armenian Apostolic Church of Sup Asfatzazin, Holy Mother of God. Look at it. I mean, Etchmiadzin will fit inside this church very, very easily. Next. Again, you see where the altar was. Now we have a Turkish flag there, because the khutbah is on the right side. Look at the huge space of this church. built by the Eintopsis. Next. Here is it's been used for many things, including a prison. Now it's been converted to a mosque, and you see the two minarets, but you still see the dome. Now again, these are all Armenian wealthy homes. There's the Kurkchan Khan, and there are Nazaretian, number of very important wealthy Armenian families. These were their homes that have been now taken over and have been converted to coffee houses and boutique hotels. Next. Here's a typical one. This is now the city museum. Next. You see they are, again, renovating the old quarter. Next. Boutique hotel. A coffee house. And this was an Armenian home. And again, it's almost humiliating to get excited by finding an Armenian inscription somewhere, as if we've made a great discovery. I mean, we've gotten so poverty-stricken that we have to get happy about finding this next slide. On the second floor of that building, just a fading memory of the great families, the wealthy Armenian bourgeoisie of Aintab. Next. We're now going towards Zeitun. Next. Zeitun, you can see before and after 1915. Next. Now a very small town. Next. Next. Very pretty. And this river and gorge is where Armenians were thrown down to be killed. The rushing stream below and rocks. This was an Armenian Akhpur. The only place where we really encountered hostility from soldiers who didn't want us to take any pictures here, didn't want us to do anything. They were rather mean, Next. And this was interesting because, apparently, because so many American Armenians are going to Zeitun on a pilgrimage, that the local government now has created a monument in memory of the Turks massacred by the Armenians, and covered with inscriptions by Mustafa Kemal about the Armenians and how the Armenians were greedy and so forth, but now things are all good. That is after 1920s, because they had gotten everything they wanted, and now we live in peace. So it's saying, after the Kars Treaty, is that right? That there is peace and everything is okay. Is that right, Mr. Dr. Dagh? Something like that. All right. Turkish has changed. The language changes a lot. Next. And now finally in Karaman, Marash, or Marash as we know it. And here is the city of Marash, a large city. It was an area, again, very unusual because it was a city where probably the Armenian Apostolics were a minority. At least a third of the city was Protestant, Armenian Protestant, and a very, very large Armenian Catholic population. And again, it was like Hadjin, one of those areas to which the Armenians returned after the deportations of 1915, and where the French occupied the city, and where the French commander had dinner almost every day with a prominent Armenian Catholic family, the Herlakian family. And on the night before the French secretly withdrew from the city, they again had dinner and didn't warn his host that he should prepare to leave. And instead they put socks on their horses so no one could hear the horses leave the city in the middle of the night in February of 1920. And after the French left and started blowing up the dynamite, the Armenians became terrified. They fled into the city or into the snow. It was blizzard. And by the time they got to Islahia, hundreds of them had turned into snow mounds and died on the way. And those others who remained were trapped in their churches and were burned alive in their churches. So Marash had a very sad ending in 1920, like Hadjin. Here it is. Next. Next. This is the old Hittite gates to the city of Marash. This is known as the Khanla Dere area. All Armenian homes. Next. Next. Those two, by the way, this was the orphanage for girls. Is it Bethel? Bethel Orphanage, and the other one was for boys. You can see it's abandoned now. The American School, where the American missionaries and Stanley Kerr, who's written Lions of Marash, stood here and watched the burning of the city and the destruction of the Armenians below him, and is written in this book's Lions of Marash. Next. Large city. Next. And I'm going to end with this sort of happy picture. Marash si Dondurma, Marash si Wagbag, which is very, very thick, so thick that you have to use a sharp knife and a fork to be able to eat this. And so this was our search for Giligya. We saw much of it, we saw part of it, we saw it vanishing, we understood its glory at one time and its memory today. Thank you very much. So I think it's now 9:30, almost. I've tired you. No, that's all I want to show. If you want about 5 minutes of discussion, we can do that. Well, you're testing him. We don't want to test. He went to school 60 years ago, so we can't say that. Yeah, anything you want to ask further? Yes.
How much did they know about your presence in there?
The first trip they knew a lot about me because we were followed with a unmarked interior ministry car on the entire trip. They wrote daily reports. And one day they lost us for a half a day and they were terrified because they had to report to their seniors where we were and what we were doing. And so they did. On the last two trips, they probably knew, but because I was with an Armenian group, with Aroyan, maybe they did or didn't. I expect they did know what we're doing and they did know something, but no trouble. Yeah. Yeah, he's just talking about the Treaty of Kars.
And he's saying that the desires of the Armenians that were not realistic.
Yeah, the unrealistic
desires. And the capitalistic economies of the world, led by the capitalistic of the world, in the best way was solved by the Kars, by the Treaty of Kars. And from now on, those two people that for centuries have been very good friends, we hope that they will go on being friends from now on.
Of course, it says, if you didn't hear the translation, the Armenians who had these unrealistic desires and were prodded on by the capitalistic countries, that issue has now been resolved by the Treaty of Kars. That is the Treaty of 1921, which set the current boundaries between Turkey and Armenia, and that the two people can again live in peace. Is there anything else? Right? Yes. But you have to speak up because I'm getting deaf.
Arab Abyan, the former ambassador of Armenia in Canada, he's writing a lot of articles about the official document that the Armenian scholars or the politicians have not yet used to full extent in order to get something from Turkey, as far as Hadjin, I don't know, is this man a Yeradades or is there something there? So he writes almost every week.
You need to ask Mr. Bobbian. He's talking about the Wilsonian arbitration, which set the boundaries. And as you know, some of our political parties still insist that that is their objective. It's all of our objective. We'd like to get them, but the question is how you're going to do that. I disagree with Mr. Bobbian, and I've told him that on the binding nature of that arbitration. I don't think that the treaty was never ratified. He insists that because it was done separately by Wilson, that it has nothing to do directly with the Treaty of Sevres, but it's separate. I mean, if you can make the case, more power to him. But I can't say much about it.
What's your feeling about the new government?
Well, the new government in Turkey, it's hard to say, you know. On some days he speaks such nationalistic, imperialistic tones. I mean, his victory speech, we're talking about Erdogan. And I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not the right person to ask this question to. But he made it sound like that he was the door to everywhere in all countries, and anybody that wanted to do anything with the Arab world, the Persian world, the Caucasian world, they had to go through him. That's what he was basically what he was saying. On the other hand, most Armenians probably voted for him. Most Armenians voted for Erdogan because they feel that he is better than the Republican Party of Kemal, who makes nice comments but doesn't do anything and still is very nationalistic, and is better than the nationalists who are very clearly anti-minority. Erdogan, again, is a contradiction. On the one hand, he appeals to the chauvinism and nationalism of the Turks and feeds it. On the other hand, he gives the Armenians a little space. They have a little space. On April 24th, you know, a few people can gather and have a meeting about the Armenian genocide. Armenian churches, you've probably read Galvatsnet. Armenian church, a lot of property has been confiscated. They are now in various tots in court cases where they're getting a bit of a property or some hadusum back. So they're saying that this guy, they are afraid of his religious extremism or the possible religious extremism. This guy is doing a little more than anyone else. He's giving us a little breathing space. That's all I can say. Anything else? Is it because of the EU? I don't know if it's because of the EU. I think, I'm not sure the Turks are that excited about the EU anymore. So I think it's about him. He's a very clever individual that knows how to talk in different tongues, different people, and makes it seem like he's really very critical to everyone. Also to the Soviets, I mean to the Russians. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hovannisian. And again, please buy the books and also the announcements for the next lecture. The flyers are here. And if we don't have your email address and you would like to get the announcements for our next lectures, please give us your email address. Thank you.